Okay, I think it's already 6:30 Indonesian time, so I think we can start now. Selamat malam, selamat pagi, good evening, and good morning to all of the attendees and distinguished speakers wherever you are at the moment. I am Firman Lung and I will be your host for today's session. And welcome to the first collaborative academic writing workshop organized between the Social Science Research Council, or SSRC, and the American Institute for Indonesian Studies, known as AIFIS. Both of these organizations have conducted similar workshops independently in the past, but this is the first time they have collaborated to present this workshop for you, and I'm very excited for this. And as I'm sure many of you are aware at the moment, there is a great deal of pressure for Indonesian academics to publish in international English language and Scopus recognized journals. It is a crucial aspect for attaining promotion and tenure that can be a rather large obstacle for many. The pressure to publish does not only affect Indonesian academics, just like me, for example, but for graduate students, junior lecturers, and adjunct professors seeking tenure, track position around the world. The pressure to publish is very high, but the training needed to write for international publication is not always accessible. Therefore, this workshop was designed as a bridge to connect, the gap between the academic writing oriented towards attaining an advanced degree and the academic writing skills necessary to successfully publish in internationally recognized peer-reviewed journals. And this workshop has been carefully curated to provide Indonesian scholars with basic information about publishing in highly ranked English language academic journals. And of course, the goal of the workshop is to help researchers prepare manuscripts that will training. And the presentations to take place over this 3-day webinar series will first explain what editors look for when reviewing submissions, and then second, highlight the underlying dynamics of argumentation in a research article so that the presentation is clear and effective. And then the third one, this webinar will increase awareness of linguistic conventions that will help convey ideas accurately, clearly, and appropriately. And then fourth, it will discuss strategies for planning and revising a manuscript. Okay, just a little bit of information about this whole workshop. So due to the significant amount of interest and participation in this event, we have decided to present the first 3 days of the workshop as a public webinar for all applicants to access. 24 selected participants will continue from these public events to have their own projects discussed in direct consultation with the workshop presenters. But in the spirit of equity and inclusion, we want to ensure that all of the applicants and any other interested academics, writers have an equal opportunity to benefit from the information and expertise that will be shared by our esteemed presenters, who I am now honored to introduce to you. Okay, so here are our presenters. So the first one, we have Mr. Paul Kratowska. Hi, Paul, how are you? So he was formerly the managing director of NUS Press at the National University of Singapore, and he is past editor of the Journal of Southeast Asian Studies and current editor of the Journal of the Malaysian branch of the Royal Asiatic Society. Before going into academic publishing, he taught in the Philippines, Malaysia, and at the National University of Singapore. He has published books and articles on the Japanese occupation, the history of rice cultivation, ethnic minorities, school textbooks, and academic publishing, and was a contributor to the Cambridge History of Southeast Asia and the Cambridge History of World War II. He serves on the boards of several journals and is lead mentor for the Social Science Research Council's Global Scholars Initiative. So thanks to have you on board, Paul.
Thank you. Nice to see everybody.
Thank you. Okay, so the second one, we have Susan Lopez-Nurning. Hi, Susan. So she designed, she coordinated and taught language, writing, and professional communication courses for undergraduates and graduates in the Center for English Language Communication at the National University of Singapore from 1992 until 2013. She has conducted writing workshops for graduate degree candidates and junior faculty in Japan, Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaysia, Taiwan, Thailand, the Philippines, and also Indonesia. And she is a mentor for the US Social Science Research Council's Global Scholars Initiatives also. Okay, thank you, Susan, for coming.
So good to be here and looking forward to with everyone.
Thank you very much. The third one, we have Paul Learning. He designed, he taught, and he also coordinated courses in English as a second language and English as a first school language for the Center for English Language at NUS. And he also worked under the Provost's office to design, teach, and coordinate writing and critical thinking models for the University Scholars Program and the University Town Residential Program. And more recently, he has conducted writing workshops for graduate degree candidates and junior faculty in Japan, Singapore, Malaysia, Taiwan, Thailand, the Philippines, Hong Kong, and Indonesia. And he's also a mentor for the US Social Science Research Council's Global Scholars Initiative. Hi, Paul. It's good to have you here.
Good to be back again, Furman. Very nice to see you and everybody else. Looking forward to meeting everybody and working with you guys.
Thank you. Okay, last but not least, we have Linda Grove. She is the consulting director of the Social Science Research Council's Tokyo office and program director for the Council's Global Scholars Initiative. She formerly taught Chinese social and economic history at Sophia University in Tokyo, where she served as dean and vice president with responsibility for international programs and research management. And her publications include books and articles on Chinese rural industrialization and social change, East Asia trade history, and Chinese women's history, as well as translations of Japanese and Chinese scholarship on Chinese history. Hi, Linda.
Hi, it's nice to see everybody. I'm happy to be here.
Okay, so those are just a glimpse of the bio of our presenters. And yeah, without further ado, I think I will now welcome to share remarks before we start our session for today. Linda, you may have the floor.
So I have the floor. So I would like to say a few words on behalf of the Social Science Research Council. I think those of you who have been in America probably know SSRC, but maybe some other people don't. It's one of America's oldest joint academic organizations. We will be celebrating the 100th anniversary in 2023. SSRC was originally organized by existing discipline-based academic associations who got together to join in common projects for promoting the social sciences and the use of social science knowledge to solve real-world problems. And that continues to be the kind of big mission of the Social Science Research Council. Over the years, since the beginning, some 18,000 fellowships and grants have been managed by the Social Science Research Council. It has a number of major projects going. The money for all of this, or the funding for it, comes from a variety of philanthropic organizations. This particular project is funded by the Luce Foundation, which again, I think many of you know. It has been active in Asia for a long time, and it funded earlier workshops that AIFIS ran. I want to just say a few words about why we got involved with this particular project. And some of it has to do with my own feelings about it as well. Furman already talked about the problems that young Indonesian scholars face, and they're common, in fact, to scholars, young scholars, probably all over the world, although I'm most familiar with the problem in Asia, where 25 years ago, you could do your research and write in your own language and there was no problem. Now people expect you to, in fact, try to publish in English in international journals. And you have to learn sort of new techniques to do that. The pressure is very strong, and sometimes it's hard to keep jobs if you don't do it. But there's another motivation behind it, which really has to do with the kind of knowledge that is being created in Asia by Asian scholars, but does not often get into the kind of international discourses on what's going on. I can remember when I'm a China scholar, but I came to Japan when I was very young because Americans couldn't go to China. And I can remember being told by scholars who will remain nameless at my university in the US who said, go, see what sources those people are using, but don't listen to what they're saying. At that time, it was because they thought they were all Marxist and we shouldn't be tainted by Marxism. But it was basically they didn't have much respect for the kind of an analytical points that Asian scholars were making. We believe, and the Luce Foundation also believes, that it's very, very important that the knowledge that is produced in Asia is in fact presented to the international academic community. So we're doing this for two reasons. One, to help younger scholars in Asia with their careers and to get published, but also to help the larger world community, both academic, policy communities, to share in the knowledge that all of you are creating and to help you figure out how to present it in a way that it's going to catch attention. It doesn't do any good to just throw it out there. It needs to catch attention, and we're trying to help you figure out how to do that in an effective way so that it will be read. I think that's all I want to say. I look forward to meeting people through this workshop. I've been to many countries in Asia, but unfortunately Indonesia is not one. And I was hoping we could do an in-person workshop and actually get a chance to see things, but maybe next time. So now I'd like to turn the microphone over to Megan Hewitt, who is the Executive Director of AIFIS.
Thank you so much, Linda. I also hope we'll be able to have an in-person workshop sometime in the near future. I'm going to say a few words on behalf of AIFIS. Thank you to Linda, Paul, Susan, Paul, and Firman. Dan terima kasih banyak kepada peserta yang hadir hari ini. Thank you to SSRC for their collaboration on presenting this event and for the generous sponsorship of the Henry Luce Foundation. I also want to offer a great deal of gratitude to the AIFIS team, Bapak Yosef Jakababa, AIFIS Country Director, and Bapak Anas Bentari, AIFIS Program Manager, for their tireless work in taking care of the often unseen labor of organizing a workshop such as this. In preparation for this workshop, we received an astounding 175 applications from a very broad range of humanities, social science, and STEM fields. The application review process was, as you can imagine, very competitive. And while we were only able to invite 24 participants into the mentored session, we deeply appreciate the hard work of everyone who applied. Seeing also that there are sort of upwards of 120 participants right now in the room with us, and I believe we have registered over 300 participants. I am very inspired to know that there are so many motivated academic writers out there. As Firman indicated at the beginning, and as Linda so nicely echoed, we are offering this public session, all these 3 days of public sessions, in service of providing greater equity and access to knowledge about international publication. And we sincerely hope that you will all benefit from these 3 days of public sessions. I want to announce briefly that AIFIS and SSRC will be offering another academic writing workshop in the spring of 2022. Many of those sessions will also be offered for anyone to join, and 16 participants will also be selected to work one-on-one with academic mentors from AIFIS's larger consortium of American scholars who will have similar disciplinary interests as their peer mentors in Indonesia. For that workshop, Participants will submit a full draft of a manuscript to give everyone a heads up for what's to come. And then that paper will be workshopped in detail with their mentors. Those selected participants will also have an opportunity to present their papers in June of 2022 at our next Indonesian Studies Conference, which AIFIS organizes in collaboration with Michigan State University. So stay tuned to the AIFIS website and social media for announcements about when that application will be open in the next few months. In echoing Linda's comments about the importance of recognizing a greater diversity of Asian voices within academic discourse, I want to share a rather famous quotation from Pramudia Anantatur. Orang boleh pandai setinggi langit, tapi selama ia tidak menulis, ia akan hilang di dalam masyarakat dan dari sejarah. Menulis adalah bekerja untuk keabadian. One may be as clever as the sky is high, but without writing, you will be lost in society and missing from history. Writing is the work of immortality. Now, we know Pramudia today as arguably one of the most renowned Indonesian authors, and his immortality is fixed in many ways by his written works of literature. But Pramudia was first and foremost an academic writer, a historian of Indonesia's pre-national past. And while the direct legacies of his historical scholarship are in some ways no longer available to us, his fictional works remain infused with the nuances of historical details which he acquired through academic research, and which he also transformed in many ways through memory into powerful allegories and collective insights that feature in the genres of historical fiction. As academic writers today, we are of course writing in a much different genre than the literary works of Pram, but in a similar fashion, our work is to articulate the nuances of the world around us through the lens of our respective scholarly disciplines. We strive to share those views with audiences beyond our immediate surroundings, according to conventions of writing that help shape a global academic communities of readers and writers. The presenters assembled for this workshop, Linda Grove, Paul Kratoska, Susan Lopez-Nerney, and Paul Nerney, are experts in the conventions of academic writing. As they share those skills with us, it is our task to apply those tools to our respective research contexts and push the boundaries of our own knowledge, to build upon the scholarship of others and contribute innovative ways of conceiving the world around us. The immortality which Pram speaks in academic writing is an engagement with a discourse that both precedes and supersedes us as individuals. But it is within that engagement, that exchange in which we participate in a discourse that extends beyond us, that we are able to learn together. It is in that spirit of participatory learning that I hope this workshop will inspire and motivate you all to continue writing. One last comment. At AIFIS, we really strive to be a platform through which you can articulate and express your voice to wider audiences. It is of paramount importance for global academics to recognize the significant contributions of Indonesian scholars and global scholars within many and diverse fields of academic inquiry. When you get published, please let us know, and we will be happy to highlight your work in our networks and continue to grow our scholarly community across the globe. Thank you again for your participation, and I look forward to reading your academic writings in the future. It's my pleasure now to return your attention back to our MC and moderator for the webinar this evening, Firman. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much once again, Linda and Megan. And yeah, thank you for the beautiful quote from Pramudia, which reminds and illustrates why we are here full of spirit for the entire workshop. I mean, based on the chat, I believe most of us are very relatable to that particular quote. Thank you very much, Megan. Okay, so before we begin, I want to outline some logistical details. Since the first 3 days of this workshop are being offered as a public webinar, we ask that if you have any questions throughout the entire presentations, feel free to ask. However, if you are currently attending this workshop directly through our Zoom webinar, please, you can type the questions directly using the Q&A feature. Okay, so please don't ask the question through the chat box, but instead you can type your questions with the feature of the Q&A that this Zoom has. And if you're accessing this webinar through YouTube, you can directly text your question through the chat feature on the YouTube. And yeah, so during the sessions and at the end of each day of presentations, we, the moderators, myself and Pinkhani, who you will meet tomorrow, will direct your questions to the workshop presenters. Okay, and yeah, as you might have noticed based on the technicalities that I just told you, this workshop is also being streamed on YouTube and will remain accessible after the event. So we will drop the links into the chat to access those videos at the start of each day. After the event, you will also be able to find the link at AIFIS.org/academic writing. Okay, so I think that's enough for me speaking. So I think it is my pleasure to officially commence the AIFIS-SSRC Academic Writing Workshop. And I will now invite Paul Tartelska to begin the first presentation on what journal editors look for and writing for publication. Paul?
Well, thank you very much, Firman. And while I echo the sentiment that we're all very sorry that we aren't able to do this in Indonesia, one of the advantages of doing it as a virtual workshop is that we're able to have an audience that spans the archipelago. When we do the workshop in person, of course, the transport and lodging issues limit the number of people that can participate. So there are some distinct advantages to holding this as a virtual workshop. I would also like, well, first to welcome everybody and also to express my own appreciation, I guess, on behalf of our team of presenters, to everybody who's been involved in getting this workshop organized, getting it online. There's a lot of effort behind the scenes, and we deeply appreciate this. The presentation I'm going to give you I'm going to divide it into 3 parts, but I've sent around a PDF, which some of you may have received, which is the entire thing in a single document. This is only sent to the active participants registered for the workshop. But if you have that, then you're welcome to read along as I do the presentation. There will be some slight variations between what I'm saying and what you see on that sheet, but mostly you'll be able to follow it easily enough. So I'm going to share the screen now. And over the time we were practicing, this didn't always work, but let me just see if I can make it work now. And that did not work, so just give me a minute. I have to stop sharing, try it again. Okay. Now, if somebody can signal to me whether you're seeing what you should be seeing. Megan says yes.
Perfect, okay. Paul.
Yeah, it's good.
Okay, so we're underway. And to begin with, let's just say that the goal of research is publication. Honestly, if you do research and don't publish, just put it up on your shelf, it's really hardly worth the time and effort, because you do research to communicate with other scholars, to exchange ideas. So fundamentally, when you're doing research, your focus needs to be on how you're going to distribute your findings, how you're going to publish your outcomes. And these days, universities are asking staff to publish articles in highly ranked Western journals that are published in English. but very few postgraduate programs teach anything about professional writing. And frankly, student essays and dissertations are not much good in the way of providing training for academic publishing. So let's look at the publishing process the way people normally envision it. You do some research, then you pick a topic. You select the material that you're going to put into the article or the book about that topic. You write it up, and then you submit a manuscript. You will then receive referees' reports. You will revise your article based on those reports, and you'll resubmit it. It gets accepted, you get the page proofs, you do proofreading, and then you receive the publication. And if only it were that simple, it would really be very nice. The fly in the ointment is right here. And that is when you submit the manuscript, the first thing that's going to happen is an editorial review. And this is where an editor looks at the manuscript and is essentially saying, does this manuscript really have any prospect of being published? And unfortunately, what sometimes, and well, actually quite a bit of the time happens, is more like this. You get the editorial review, and within a few days, you get a rejection because the editor has decided, for whatever reason, and there are a lot of possible reasons, that this article is not something that the journal is going to pursue. So what we're doing in this workshop is starting more or less with this editorial review. And what we're going to do is try to help you produce a manuscript that will get you past the editorial review and on to the refereeing process. So let's begin with a question here. And that is, what do editors want? Because that is actually what's going to get you through this kind of review process. And most of you would probably not come up with the answer that I'm just giving you, which is readers. I think if I asked each one of you, your answer would probably be, oh, new ideas, innovative research, something of social value. And of course, we all want those things. But the problem is, if nobody reads it, then it doesn't really accomplish anything. So fundamentally, what we're looking for as editors and publishers is manuscripts that people are going to read. And I've been through a lot of editorial discussions over the years. And the first question is always, who is going to read this? And the second question will be something along the lines of, well, so what? Does this really matter? Well, what that comes down to is the same question, because if it matters, if it seems significant, people will read it. If it doesn't, then people won't. And an article, a manuscript that's published and not read is really wasting time and it's wasting resources. If it's a journal article, that already chews up quite a lot of editorial time, but it also takes a certain amount of space in the journal that could be used by another author. So if the manuscript really has no prospects, the editor is going to send out a desk rejection. And I'm afraid that over the years, as I've talked to people, not just in Indonesia, but a lot of Asian countries, and I say, have you ever submitted an article to a major journal? The answer is very often, yes, I did. And within a week, I got a rejection. Fundamentally, what that's telling you is that the person who did the editorial screening decided not to pursue it. What the person got, it may not be labeled desk rejection, but that's what it is. Well, let's take a step further here. What do authors want? Well, of course, authors want to get published. But why do authors want to get published? Why do people want to do research and publish? Well, the obvious answer is to satisfy university requirements and advance their careers. Second thing is to communicate with other scholars. And the third, to make a contribution, you notice, is a capital K on knowledge, to make a contribution to knowledge. As an editor, I understand that many people are doing research for the first reason, because their university is telling them you need to do this. And if you want to stay in the field, if you want to prosper in your career, you publish. For me as an editor, this is not the right answer. The right answer really needs to be, because I have something to say that I want to communicate with other scholars. And yes, of course, this satisfies the university requirement. But really the focus of a publication needs to be what the publication is communicating. And of course, articles that are not read don't do much to advance a career. They don't do much to communicate, and they don't contribute to knowledge. As you all know, I think if you're going to advance your career with an article, it will depend on the impact the article has. And there are lots of indexers who are trying to figure out just how many people are reading your article, what the impact factor is. So at the end of the day, authors want the same thing that editors want and publishers want. They want readers. So that takes us maybe to the heart of the matter. What do readers want? Now, I think each one of you should ask yourself, what is it that you look for when you are reading an article? These days, most everybody has hundreds of articles that are relevant to their own interests and their own research, and not nearly enough time to read all of them. My answer to this question, though, is readers want information, they want explanations, and they want interpretations. And in short, they want answers to questions. Now, information is the answers to factual questions, questions of what, who, when, and where. What happened? Who did it? When did it happen? Where did it happen? And answers to those questions can be verified, because people don't, when they're academics, if they're doing the job right, they don't pluck the answers out of thin air. They have sources. And so they have sources that they point to and they say, this is where I got that piece of information. Now, of course, that doesn't guarantee that it's true, because sources are also inaccurate. But at least it means that you got a piece of information somewhere and you can tell people where it came from. And you will cite that in your article. So these are verifiable pieces of information. And articles and books, at their core, are starting with a piece of information. Then you go on to explanation, and explanation is why something happened or how it happened. And then the next step is interpretation. Excuse me, why it matters, what are the consequences, what are the implications? Now, both explanation and interpretation look like statements of fact. So if I tell you COVID is spreading because, and I can give you several different reasons, because of the way it's infectious, because of interpersonal contacts, whatever. That sounds like a fact. Or I could give you an interpretation. Okay, the economic consequences or the psychological or the sociological consequences of COVID are. And again, that looks very much like a fact. But in fact, they are not. It's not a fact. It's not a verifiable fact. It's an argument. In other words, this is my judgment. This is my opinion. And while facts are either right or wrong, judgments or opinions are not. I mean, you think what happens, everybody sees legal dramas. And so you're trying to find out if somebody is guilty or not. And generally speaking, the formulation is beyond reasonable doubt, which is to say we can never be absolutely clear about a judgment, but we can say the bulk of the evidence supports a certain outcome. But it's useful and important actually to keep in mind as you're making statements, the distinction between statements of fact, explanations, and interpretation. So coming back to readers, who is going to read your article? And actually several people will, and each reader is going to come to the article with a different set of questions. You yourself are the first reader. When you're writing, you're essentially talking to yourself. You're asking questions and you're putting down answers to those questions. I've listed some of the questions that everybody goes through, but there's so many for this, for yourself as the first reader. What am I explaining? How should I present it? Am I making myself clear? Have I included enough detail, or have I put in too much detail? Is my argument convincing? And have I shown people why they should read the article? And that's just the beginning, but you need to be questioning constantly what you're doing. The second set of readers, ideally, you'll show your article to some friends or colleagues. It's useful when you've written an article to explain it to someone else and see what kind of questions they ask, because you understand what's in your article. The problem is, the question is whether you've explained it clearly enough that other people can understand it. And one thing that's really quite good is if you have a group that can get together, maybe 3 or 4 people, and you talk to each other about work that you're doing. We've done this in this present workshop in the form of small group sessions. And so the people who are active participants will take part in small group sessions. And in those sessions, they will be expected to explain to the other participants in their own group just what they're doing and try to find out if they make themselves clear. Okay, the third reader you're going to come across is an editor. And the editor is going to have another set of questions, starting with, does this seem worth publishing? Will my readers be interested? And by that, I mean, the editor of a journal has a pretty good sense of what the readers of the journal are looking for. And so a journal will publish a certain type of article, a certain type of topic. And the question then is, well, the people that read this journal are my constituency. And if the journal is going to succeed, I have to publish things that they're interested in. Then, is there an argument? And is it a good one? And do the sources look right? Are they up to date? Are they thorough? Now, this question about sources being up to date, and I'll tell you a little story here. I got an article a couple of years ago. And when I looked at this article, I looked at the sources, and bearing in mind that this would have been 2019, the most recent source that was cited was from 1996. And almost immediately, I knew exactly what was going on. So I looked up the author of this article. And what year do you suppose the author got his PhD? Well, 1996. So what he had done was, some 20 years later, he thought, well, I need a publication. I'm going to take a chapter out of my dissertation and see if I can get it published. But he hadn't updated anything. And honestly, that's as far as I went, because something that's that far out of date is really not going to be publishable. Okay, after the editor, the readers will be referees. This is assuming you get past that preliminary screening. The referees are going to be asking a whole series of questions, but in some, is the topic important? That is it important for this field of study? Is the information accurate? Is it complete? Is the analysis solid? And what does the piece contribute to the field of study? And finally, if you get it published, it will be the people who read the journal. And their questions are going to be quite different because, as I said, there are so many articles out there. And so the question is really going to be, should I choose to spend time on this article as opposed to anything else I might read? Will reading it be worth the time and effort I put into it? What kind of information will I find here? Is the analysis going to help me with my own research? Is this material useful for teaching? And if you want to get published, you need to anticipate these questions and answer them. And you really need to answer them early in the article, because many readers are going to make decisions based on the title, the abstract, the keywords, the introduction, and the conclusion. And quite frankly, many journal editors do the same thing. This is the basis of many of their early decisions. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing now and start up the second part. So there'll be about maybe a 1-minute break here while I get the second part up and going.
Yeah, so while we're waiting for Paul, I just would like to remind you, for the participants, if you have any question, feel free to ask the question. If you are at the Zoom webinar, you can use the Q&A feature, which is at the bottom of your screen. If you're listening through the YouTube, you can just directly text your question through the chat box to the comment section. Okay.
Okay, so we're back. Let me just get
Okay.
this going again. And Megan, are we still seeing the right thing?
Yep, we are.
Okay. One of the problems that Indonesian scholars face is that they're writing mainly about Indonesia and they're using local information. Now, why is this a problem? Well, if you're publishing internationally, your audience is going to include people who know almost nothing about Indonesia and maybe don't particularly care about local details. So what I'm going to do in this section is to talk a little bit about how you can take material that you have collected locally in Indonesia and put it into an article in a way that will attract readers who are not interested necessarily in the specific thing that you're studying. Think about local details in almost any country. They're mostly interesting to people in that country. Now, say at NUS Press, we publish books on most of the countries in Southeast Asia. And not surprisingly, books on Thailand mainly sold to buyers in Thailand. Books on Indonesia, the market was more likely to be Indonesia, and so on. But for an international referee journal, then you need to interest people outside of Indonesia. And the way that you set about doing this would be that you look for features of your research that will interest people somewhere else, somewhere outside. And to begin with, I'm going to suggest a way that you can position your article within a field of study, because this will help you understand who might be interested in reading your article. So what I've done is to start off with this is an entirely fictional paper, but it's a paper about the 2020 gubernatorial election in Central Sulawesi province. So the reason I picked this is that you obviously have a group of people who really are interested in Central Sulawesi and who runs it. But what we're trying to do is find a way to get people, a broader circle of people interested in reading this piece. So the way I would suggest that you tackle this, you start off by saying, what is the general field that this study falls in? And let's say that you're interested in power and authority. Now, of course, people all over the world are interested in power and authority. And we can divide this into two types, formal and informal. Well, the results of elections are formal. Okay, then subset of that, there's power and authority in Indonesia. And there you have central authority, you have provincial authority, and you have local authority. As a subset of that, we have then power and authority in provincial Indonesia. That would include elected and appointed individuals. Then you have power and authority in Central Sulawesi province. And we're talking about the governor, and specifically then the 2020 gubernatorial election. So your starting point, if you're going to write about this, is simply what happened in the 2020 gubernatorial election. And if you're studying this, you presumably have collected a lot of information. But the question is, how do you put this information together effectively? Well, you might go on to say, who won the election? And obviously, it's easy to find that out. You look at a newspaper, you look online, and you'll discover who won the election. And you'll discover some other pieces of information. So Rusty Mastura was the victor. That's a factual piece of information. And just a quick look will say that there are certain features of this man that might be relevant to looking at why he won. One is that he issued a public apology for what happened in 1965. A second is that he proposed, he was formerly a mayor, and as a mayor, he proposed a special economic zone. Third, he developed a work program for poor people. And fourth, he was a former member of Golkar, but he left the party. So you have these pieces of information. Some of them will be of general interest, maybe some of them less so. So what do you do with them? Well, first of all, you have the question, the explanation. So the explanation here would be why and how did Rusty win? This gives you a narrative. The narrative has a beginning, a middle, and an end. He ran for office, he campaigned, he won. And then you could explain, based on your study, these are the reasons why he won or how he won. And that gives you a reasonable story. The question is, how many people are going to read it? And you will get a readership with that. But if you're sending this to an international journal, it's not necessarily going to be very effective. There are a lot of other interesting questions, though, you might ask. You might say, well, what was the role played by social media? What about social relations in the voting community? Would psychology come into play? Would economic issues come into play? And then, of course, there's that apology and the importance of the lingering effects of 1965. So you could write about this election simply from the standpoint of who won it and how and why did they win. Or you could take it from a different angle and you could say, okay, I'm going to look at social media in this election. Now, there are people who are interested in social media in elections who aren't studying Indonesia, but they're studying other parts of the world. So if you write about it in that way, you're broadening your potential audience. Similarly, there are people who are interested in economic development. And okay, here's a special economic zone. So this is a man who proposed one of these places. You could use that as a kind of a hook to get into the question of what happened during the election. So there are a lot of different ways that you can tackle this. And so the potential audience includes people with all these different interests. The readership you're going to draw is going to depend on which aspect of the story you choose to emphasize in writing the article. So if you're trying to write for an international journal, but your topic is local and your information is local, what you want to do is look for universal themes. And let me give you another example. Some years ago, I was doing a workshop in Jakarta for UI, and one of the participants had done a study of a village in West Java. Now, this village was in the hills, and they didn't get any kind of a good television signal. So the children were not really exposed to national media. These children, when they were at home, spoke Sundanese. So when they went into school, they didn't have much exposure to Bahasa Indonesia. And at school, then they had to cope with the fact that classes were being conducted in Bahasa Indonesia. So how can you write about this? Well, if you do it as a local study of the village, you have a very limited readership. On the other hand, the phenomenon of children whose home and school languages are different is fairly widespread. It's certainly widespread all across Indonesia. It's found in other parts of Asia. So if you write about that topic, the experience of children whose home language and school languages are different, you use West Java as a case study. Then you have broadened your readership considerably beyond just a very local study. And I'll give you one further example here. Some years ago, again, I was working on an article that somebody had submitted that dealt with the Cambodian textile industry. So if you put out an article with that title, the Cambodian textile industry, your readership will consist of people who are interested in Cambodia, the Cambodian economy, and the textile industry. But reading the article, I quickly realized that the key thing that was going on with the Cambodian textile industry was it depended on Chinese foreign direct investment. So if your title becomes, it's the same article, but if your title becomes Chinese foreign direct investment and the Cambodian textile industry, your readership expands enormously because there are a lot of people interested in Chinese FDI. So what you're again doing here is you have a local topic, but what you're doing is looking for some aspect of that topic that can expand beyond the local. And then another thing you can try to broaden your readership is to write a comparative study. So there are these different techniques that you can adopt that will help you with a local topic, help you when you have collected data in Indonesia, and find a way to make it interesting for people who have no immediate interest in Indonesia, but will have an interest in some of the things that are going on there because they have parallels with the kind of work that they're doing. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing again, and there will be a bit of a break, and then we'll go to the third part of this session. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about now is writing for publication. Research begins with questions. This is where I began this talk. The entire process revolves around questions. The better the questions you ask, the better your results are going to be. But writing begins with answers. Research is very confusing and very messy because you collect pieces of information not in a particularly systematic way, and then you have to put it all together. Writing needs to be clear and orderly. Sometimes I get articles where somebody essentially takes me through the research process. They start off saying, well, here's my question. And what I did was to look at these things, and then I found something else. This is not the way to do an article. The way you do an article essentially is that you analyze it, you figure out what the answer to your question is, and you write an article about the answer. Now, before you start writing anything, you would be wise to answer the following questions, and this is just for yourself. The readership. whom do you want to read your paper? And why would they be interested? And don't just think about this, write it down and see if what you're writing down really makes sense. What question are you answering? And then what is the answer? How will you support your answer? And how will you organize your paper? It's easy to kind of slide over some of these things and think, well, yeah, I know how to do that. I'll take care of it. But it really does help if you just sit down and think it through a little bit in advance. So an article is fundamentally the answer to a question. Every article begins with a fact. So the example I was giving, well, somebody's elected governor. And then you go on from there in whichever direction you want. But the fact that you're dealing with should appear in the title. It should be at the start of your abstract, and it should also be at the start of your introduction. As an editor, that's really where I want to see these things, because I want to start off evaluating a paper knowing what's going on. And there is a horrible tendency of some authors to think, okay, I've got to lead up to this, to give some information, then some more information. Finally, yes, here's my conclusion. This is the exciting point. The problem with an academic paper is if you do it that way, I may never get to the conclusion, because there's this horrible thing that editors get, which is called a data dump, where somebody essentially says, well, here's all the information I have about this. I hope you can make some sense of it because I haven't bothered. It's not a good way to get published. So you start off with a fact, and then you follow it with an explanation and an interpretation. And those are actually the core of the article, but everything is tied to them. So you have a fact, you explain the fact, you interpret the fact, and along the way you can talk about other things, but keep this idea that you've got, this fact and the explanation of it at the core. It has to start from the beginning and run right through to the end. Okay, major elements of an article. Well, there's the title, the abstract, and the keywords. These are really important, especially these days, because they're picked up by search engines. I'm sure it's readily apparent to everybody that people these days are doing most of their reading online. When I started off, people went to a library maybe 2 or 3 times a month to see what new journals had come in. You take them off the shelf, you thumb through them. If you find an article that's interesting, you go to the photocopier. Not the way it works these days. But if you're doing an online search, what you'll be able to see without any trouble is the title, the abstract, and the keywords. And if you're looking to get readers, this is how you get them. They advertise your work. They attract readers. And you need to think about that when you're preparing a title, when you're preparing an abstract. That is the job of the title and the abstract. Whether it's effective depends how well you write it. Then there are the headings and the subheadings in the paper. There's the introduction and there's the conclusion. Now the headings and subheadings essentially outline an article. And once in a while, if I want to make a decision about an article, what I might do is just go through and write down all the headings and subheadings and read through it and see whether I have something that seems to make sense. The introduction more or less repeats what you've put into the abstract. A bit more detail, a bit greater length, but essentially an introduction should explain what the article does. It's like a roadmap. It says, okay, here's our destination. And now I'm going to tell you how we're going to get there, and then we're going to start off on our journey. The conclusion is to state what the article has done. Essentially, you say, I started off by saying, we're going to do this. I've given you all these details, and we have done it. The conclusion is not the place where you suddenly wrap everything up and say, now I've shown you these things. Here is what I want you to understand. Start by telling people where you're going and then take them there. So I'm going to go through these elements one by one very briefly. The title needs to indicate your topic. It should position your material in time and place. Ideally, it should attract readers. And it needs to be brief, just 10 or 12 words. And of course, it needs to be clear. Now, getting a good title is really difficult because you have so few words. If you look at the titles that people put on published articles, pay some attention to what's there and what they're doing with the title. But it is really quite challenging. And it's one of the last things that you should write. I mean, when you're doing an article, probably what you want to do is start with a working title. And then when you finish the piece, then you sit down and seriously think about the title. And with something like that, you probably want to work with an editor, because editors see a lot of bad titles, generally produced by authors, many fewer good titles. You want to avoid jargon. Don't put a lot of obscure terminology in the title, and don't try to be clever or cute. Don't put in unfamiliar abbreviations. So if you're writing about the United Nations, UN is fine. If you're writing about the Kuomintang, probably KMT is all right, but it depends on the journal, it depends on the audience. Then we come to the abstract, and the abstract is also a challenge. You have more words here. Generally, when I publish abstracts, I try to bring them down to 150 words. Authors generally send me more, which helps because I edit them down. And so they should be short, and they should state what the research topic is. They should state what the answer to the research question is. They should explain why the research is significant. And they need to stand alone as an explanation. And by that, I mean, if somebody reads only that, only your title and your abstract, they should really have a fairly good idea of what's in the article. Now, I had a person in my office one time who'd written a book. And I looked at what he'd done and I said, well, it's all right, but you really need to start off by explaining what your conclusion is. And he said, no, I couldn't do that. And I said, well, why not? Now I should maybe explain this man was a graduate of the top university in China. He was from Beida, and he was teaching in Japan. So this is somebody who was no slouch academically. He said, no, I couldn't do that. I said, why? He said, well, it's very simple. If I give the conclusion at the start, nobody's going to read my book. Well, this is not really true because you give me a statement of the point you're trying to make. You have to demonstrate it. You have to prove to me that you have the evidence and that your argument stands up. So what should not be in an abstract? Well, it's not the place where you want to describe the existing literature. It's not a place where you want to explain or criticize the work of other writers. And it's not a place that you want to put a lot of detail. Bearing in mind, you have this 150 words, and you're trying to say quite a lot in that very small number of words. So with an abstract, I don't want to see, I mean, again, speaking as an editor, I don't want to see something that says this article will discuss, and then you list various things. What I want to see instead is, based on a study of these things, A, B, and C, I conclude that, and then you state what your conclusion is. I definitely don't want to see an abstract that starts off by saying, in this article, I attempt to show such and such, or I try. Because frankly, if you are only attempting and you haven't gotten it done, you're not ready to publish it. So what I'd like to see is in this article, I show something or I demonstrate something. And if that somehow seems too strong to you, then you can say in this article, I argue. You need to have confidence in what you're doing. And I know a lot of people will say that they're attempting something because they're being a bit cautious. But if you're trying to publish something professionally, you need to be fairly firm in what you're trying to say and firm that you have actually done something. Now we come to keywords. And a keyword is a search term. In other words, something that people might put in to a Google search or some more specialized search engine. And the idea, again, is to attract readers and to get articles into lists of search results. Now, we all know that when you do a search, a Google search on something, you're going to get potentially millions of results. And so if you use a really general term, it's not going to be very effective. How many words? Well, probably 5 to 10. And when I say a keyword, keywords can actually be 2 or 3 words put together. There's a lot of online advice for how to select a keyword. And I really strongly suggest that you do a Google search and try to find some of this advice. Briefly though, keywords should be very specific. They should be targeted. They shouldn't be overly broad. They shouldn't be too general. They should be terms that are frequently used in your article. They should include both full and shortened names. So if you're writing about the World Health Organization, then WHO and World Health Organization, both. After you've prepared a list of keywords, then it would be smart to go to Google Scholar, put in the words you have chosen, and see what kind of articles come up. And if the articles that appear resemble your article, you probably have made a fairly good choice of keywords. Okay, the headings and subheadings. As I said earlier, this provides a kind of an outline of the article. It shows me as an editor, but also your readers, how you have organized your information and how you are proceeding step by step. And let's be honest that many readers are not going to read your article from beginning to end. They're not going to read every word. They may be interested, but they're probably going to be interested in certain parts more than others. And so with a good set of headings, a reader can follow your discussion without reading everything, and they can stop and they can read in detail the places that do interest them. Okay, the introduction and the conclusion. And I've already said something about this, but the opening paragraph tells readers where the article is going and how you're going to get there. It definitely should answer the research question. One of the things, as an editor, that I do is I look at the opening paragraph and I say to myself, what question is the author answering? Now, sometimes the author actually puts the question in, that's fine, but I want to be able to understand from the abstract and the opening paragraph what the research question is. And it shouldn't be just, this is the question I'm going to answer, but this is the answer to my research question. This is my argument. Now I will show you the evidence. And the closing paragraph just repeats this answer. He's saying, I began with this claim, I've supported it with these documents, interviews, data, what have you. And that's the end. It should not say anything new. For citations and bibliography, there are two basic standard formats. One is in-text citations, and the other is footnotes or endnotes. And many journals will use in-text citations. Some journals have variations, but key thing that you need to do is find out whether the journal requires a certain type of citation. Some journals will say, all right, if you use a standard format, we will referee the paper based on that. If we accept your paper, then we will ask you to bring what you're doing in line with the journal style. Other journals insist that you have to put the paper into the format of the journal when you submit. If you're using footnotes, then generally you put the full details of a source with the first entry and you use a short form for later entries. And the format of the bibliography. Okay, first off, some journals use bibliographies, and if you're doing the in-text citations, you have to. Some journals use footnotes and they don't have bibliography. So you look at the journal you're sending to and find out what they do. The journal will also tell you, they will have a style sheet, and this will tell you what they expect a manuscript submitted to them to look like. Then we come to the literature review. And this is one of the things that people treat as a standard part of an article. It is important to position what you're doing with respect to other articles. But fundamentally, a literature review repeats other scholars' ideas. Your article is about your new data, the analysis. You want to be selective, don't list all the articles on the topic. And you want to review ideas rather than authors. Okay, in the handout, I've got something that looks like this. Basically, what I'm saying here is that the author's tasks are twofold. You have a topic, you need to introduce it, explain it, justify it, position it, and you have an argument. You do the same. You have parts of an article, the title, the abstract, the keywords, the introduction, the body, the conclusion. You have to decide where these things go within that presentation. And then the editor will have a whole bunch of other concerns. So at the end of the session, I have a bunch of references. These I think we could put up online in some way. So the first one is some general references to academic publishing and revising a dissertation. Some things about contrastive rhetoric, which is the difference in writing style between English language authors and authors in other parts of the world using different languages. And then there's some articles specifically about contrastive rhetoric for Indonesian writing. So we'll see if we can't find a way to put those online. And I think I've probably run over a bit, but thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. Rafaska, please, we can give you a big round of applause for Paul for a very comprehensive explanation. Yeah, because me as an academic, Indonesian academic, I also struggle, how to know what it takes to publish a good international publication. And yeah, I believe there are plenty of questions, as usual, Paul, that we have here at the moment.
So are we doing this now, or is it time? Does Paul Nerney come on now? What I've kind of lost track of the time. But
yeah, so I think we still have some spare time before Paul Nerney. Is it okay if maybe we can go just some of the questions first?
Okay, well, what I suggest here is I'll answer whatever questions we can in the time we have, but we also should record these. Write them down, and we've already passed out a series of question and answer, the frequently asked questions, and we should expand on that with whatever questions we're getting now. But yes, go ahead, please.
Okay, yeah. So let me check. So the committees have curated some of the questions that are being asked by participants. Okay, so the first one, we have a question from Mordecai Sopakoli. from Pusat Studi Agama Pluralisme and Demokrasi, Universitas Kristen Satya Wacana Salatiga. So he states that I do believe that the goal of research is publication, but I do believe also that the action towards the society is also important. And sometimes we are trapped on how international journal is too focused on the difficult terminology and language for difficult language for the society. And sometimes we as scholars also only think our readers as scholars do. So how should we do to deal with that? Thank you. Yeah, so I think it's about the balance between the publications and the
actually
society.
all across Asia, there are really two, what should we call it? We could call them aliran, I guess, but there are two strains of academic writing going on. And one concerns the issues that are of local concern. And by local, I mean maybe national concern. And these issues sometimes, maybe most of the time, are discussed in national language journals. And then the other one is the international journals, the type of issues that are discussed there and the language that's used, I'd say even beyond that, the theoretical literature, the kind of background that people put into an article is different. And I think we'll just say this quite bluntly, that it's a problem that countries are expecting academics to publish in international journals when those journals have different concerns from the local concerns. And what we have discovered, just to give you a specific example, there were some papers that we saw in another workshop that were from people in Burma, from Myanmar, and they were really very practical papers that dealt with things like water supply and wells in villages and things of that kind. These would be difficult to publish in an international journal, but they were obviously issues of great importance to the locality where the research was done. So fundamentally, I think what people have to do is make a choice between publishing something for the community that they're from and the community that their research serves, and publishing something internationally. So that's my answer right now anyway, yes.
Okay, thank you, Paul. So yeah, Mordecai, I hope that answers your question. And yeah, Megan just sent to you the FAQ, the frequently asked questions from the previous workshop. So for the participants, feel free to access that. Maybe there are some questions that your questions might be there, because some of the questions might be similar with one another. But yeah, I'm going to move on to. So this is from MP Giuliani. Yeah, so this is regarding the timing of the publication. So what about the publication between 10 to 20 years ago? But the author of the article is one of the best in the field.
I don't think the question really is whether an author is any good, but whether the article is still relevant. There's a classic example here, which is Clifford Geertz. And there was a time when everybody quoted Clifford Geertz. Nowadays, hardly anybody does. And the reason is simply that the things that Geertz studied he came up with some interesting and some novel conclusions. Some of those conclusions have been discredited. But he forced people to ask questions that were really interesting. And now those questions have been asked. People have actually moved on, and there's not much point in citing Geertz these days, because there is this whole literature that has grown out of what he did. We're seeing the same thing now, I think, with Jim Scott. And there's a lot of quoting of Jim Scott, and with good reason. He's asking interesting questions. not necessarily, it's not necessarily the case that the answers that he has are the same, are going to work everywhere. And you know, I was talking to him one time about this, and he said he got a lot of criticism for the moral economy of the peasant, because people said, well, that's all very nice, but in my place, the place I do field work, it doesn't work like that. And his answer to that was, I didn't say it did. I said, in the places that I was talking about, this is the way it worked. But the second point he was making, though, is that if you look at the way it worked in the examples he gave, it gives you questions to ask about where you're doing the field work. But no, I think generally, I mean, you can go back more than 20 years, you can go back 100 years, and you find scholarship that was, I mean, people were not stupid. They were really good scholars, but they operated in a different time and with a different theoretical framework. And some of that is still useful, but fundamentally we've built on that. And what you're talking about now is making a contribution to the conversation today.
Okay, thank you, Paul. So yeah, before we move on, I would like to maybe invite all the presenters, since all the 4 presenters are in the room today. So yeah, if you want to chime in with some of the questions, feel free to do so. I believe that you can also give some a good addition to the answer. Okay, so yeah, maybe any other additional answer from the other presenters before I read the third questions? All good? Okay, then. Yeah, so the next question is from Poppy Prima Dewi. Yeah, so can you elaborate more on your statement about, yeah, I think it is, will be toward Paul. Can you elaborate more on the statement about an article has no prospect? What is usually the editor reason when she or he consider a paper has no prospect?
Well, there are a number of things that go into that decision. The first one is whether the article is within the scope of the journal. I edited the Journal of Southeast Asian Studies, and we defined Southeast Asia as a certain set of countries, which did not include Bangladesh. We received articles, though, on Bangladesh, and immediately we rejected them because we didn't publish on that. People make that kind of mistake, so that's an obvious one. Sometimes you look at an article and you feel that the author really hasn't developed a very interesting or successful argument. And the author might well come back and say, well, yeah, I think it was all right. But an editor sometimes will send this off to a specialist in that particular topic, and that person will come back and say, well, there's nothing very new in what this author is saying. So the editor will then go back to the author and say, well, I'm sorry, we're just not able to do this. There's a whole series of things that go into it, but it's a judgment that says there are more, yeah, I guess we'll say better articles. And so you just haven't written something that's going to go into the journal.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Moving on to the next question. This is a question from Arini Utami. So yeah, question to Dr. Kratoska. First, would you please elaborate again some factors that lead to desk rejection? And the second one, what are some technical strategies to find the appropriate journal to publish besides our reading list? It is more challenging today due to so many journals available out there. Thank you.
Okay, well, there's another part to this workshop coming up. I thought we had it set for June, but I don't think we've got the exact dates. And that's about getting published. So I will have more to say about picking a journal then. Right now, what I can say is that you want to look at the articles that you're reading and where those articles are published, and see if those journals would be a logical place for you to send what you've written. Again, when I was editing the Journal of Southeast Asian Studies, somebody wrote me one day and he said, I was trying to decide where to send this article. And I realized that I had used several articles published in your journal. So I thought it might be interesting for you. And he was right, and we published that article.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Yeah, so the next question, I think I'm going to pick a question for, I think this is for all the panelists. So for all of the presenters, if you have any answer, please feel free to chime in. So this is a question from Nita Rukminasari from Faculty of Marine Science and Fisheries, Universitas Hasanuddin. Is there any tips and tricks to select a potential reviewers for my manuscript?
Whoa, you don't get to select them. No, seriously, what an editor might do is say to you, would you like to suggest possible reviewers? This doesn't mean that we're going to use those reviewers, but sometimes it's interesting to see who a person picks. And the other way too, where we might say, is there anybody that you think we should not pick? Because we understand sometimes people have enemies. They have intellectual enemies who are going to criticize whatever they do. And there's not much point in asking somebody like that to referee an article. But you do not, the choice of the referee is entirely up to the editor. And so unless the editor asks specifically, you probably don't want to say these are the people that should referee it.
Yeah, so that's not up to us, but up to the reviewer. Okay. Okay, let me see. Yeah, I think this is more on the technical side. This is Enda from UGM. So she would like to ask about the maximum words in abstract. For example, some publisher had like 200 words in abstract and some might be different. So what are the tips to be able to meet that qualifications?
What I would do is start off writing at least 200 words, maybe 250, and then you go through it and you figure out what's not necessary and get it cut back. Because you really don't want a flabby abstract. You want it to be crisp, you want it to be to the point. It's a bit of a skill to be able to summarize what you're saying. But if you really understand your material, then you should be able to do that. And if you can't summarize your material in 150 words, you need to practice doing that.
Okay. So next we have a question from Tutin. So this is based on the experience. So Paul, thanks so much for the useful and insightful presentation. An editor rejected my article with the following reasons. The first one, the argument is not compelling enough. And then the second one, the argument does not add to the conceptual literature that I am addressing. And then the third one, the data appears to be insubstantial. So could you please suggest a revision to respond to those comments?
Well, the data I can't respond, but the argument answers a question. And I think that what you want to be doing is thinking about the question that you're asking and maybe consider some alternate questions. Because if the editor has said this is not good enough, you probably have other questions that you can answer. And so think about it from that point of view. Now, this would probably involve some rewriting of the article, but the point that he's making, though, or she, whoever the editor is exactly what you're going to see, what everyone's going to see, because the editor is going to evaluate your submission largely based on that kind of thing, the argument. And a lot of editors will usually know something about the field the journal covers, but not everything. So an editor is really making a preliminary judgment based on something like, what is the argument? What kind of data am I seeing? If it gets past that, then it goes to the referees. They'll be looking more carefully at the content. But if it doesn't look like you're saying anything very, well, much of a contribution, then you're likely not to be very successful. I know that doesn't give you any concrete advice, but that's pretty much what I do is start with a different question, or several questions actually. Just look at different questions and see which one turns out to be interesting.
Okay. Yeah, I believe that's going to be really helpful for Tutin from UPI. Okay, Paul, capital scouting, we have to stop you right there. So we'll continue first with Paul Nurmi, which I believe is already ready for his presentation. But yeah, please stay around because we'll continue the Q&A session after the session.
Well, just let me say first, thank you very much to everybody who listened, and do send in comments and questions because we want to respond to these things. And at some point later on, you're going to be receiving a questionnaire. And we would definitely like to hear back from you, your response to these presentations and to the workshop. So this is kind of a two-way communication, and we want to keep that going. So thank you for that.
Yes, thank you, Paul. Yeah, so yeah, just like what we already mentioned at the beginning, we really want this to be like a two-way workshop, not just one-way workshop. So that's why I encourage all of the participants to submit your questions using the Q&A feature. It's right on the on the left side of the chat box. Because if you put your questions on the chat box, I'm afraid that we will miss your question because there are so many questions and all of you are very interested in asking questions for our presenters. So yeah. Okay, so without further ado, I think I would like to invite our next presenter, Paul Nurmi. Could you please give a big round of applause?
Okay, well, thank you very much. And let's get started here. I will share my screen. I'm getting some options here. They're asking who can share, all panelists. I think I can let that go. I'm going to try that. Okay. Okay, there we go. Okay. I'm sorry. Can you see my screen?
Yes,
okay, great. Okay, well, let me just get to full screen mode then, and we'll get started. Okay, there we go. And I'm just going to reduce this a bit. Okay, great. Well, the title of tonight's talk is Later Planning and Drafting Strategies. I'll be explaining what that later planning and drafting strategies are, and I'll be focusing tonight on research paper introductions. Tomorrow night, in a sense, I continue. I'll be again looking at later planning and drafting strategies, part 2, and I'll be looking at midsection arguments because I think, as you saw from Paul Kotorska's talk, what goes on in the introduction with the topic, with questions, answers. Sorry, the recording has stopped. Is that okay?
It's okay.
Okay, I'll continue then. So what, okay, where was I? Oh yeah, okay, research paper introductions are, and midsection arguments are are connected. And so in these two talks that I'll be giving, I want to look at those the connections between those things. When we look at the research, and we're looking at research paper introductions, and we ask people questions, well, what is the hardest section of a research article to write? For research papers, people say, well, research introductions are the second most difficult thing to write. And when they're asked, well, what is the most difficult section to write? Then people will say, well, it's midsection arguments. Now, why is that? Why are we getting that? Why don't we get mention of other sections of the paper that we have? And I think the answer is because when we take a look at research paper introductions, they are rhetorically complex. Now, what I mean by that is that within a rather short space of time, because introductions aren't that long, you don't want to be spending a lot of time introducing things. You really want to get down to the answers. You want to get down to the arguments that you're doing. Nevertheless, in a research paper introduction, what you're trying to do is to frame your article as important, significant, new, and arguable. So there's a lot of stuff going on in a very, very short bit of space. On the other hand, with the midsection arguments, it's a little bit different. They're not rhetorically that complex, but they are ideationally complex. In other words, what you're trying to do is you're trying to demonstrate how various aspects of your research topic are related in ways that people did not really anticipate or think about before. And again, that's a very complex kind of thing to do, to set that up and to make it clear. And so I think this is why people are saying, well, research in research articles, midsection arguments are so difficult to write because of the ideational complexity, and introductions follow closely as kind of the number two thing because of this rhetorical complexity that I was talking about. So that's what I want to address tonight and tomorrow night as well, to kind of show you various things that you can do, particular ways of thinking about introductions, and tomorrow midsection arguments that will help you to be able to come up with something that is rhetorically complex, ideationally complex, and yet understandable. Okay, so let's get started then. The organization for this talk tonight is I will have a short introduction aside from what I just gave you. Then I'd like to take a look at choosing organizational frameworks, then constructing research article introductions, followed by a conclusion. I have some references there. I have an appendix at the end entitled 9 Commonly Researched Relationships. That's actually to get you started thinking about things that I want to say tomorrow night, but we'll go through that in just a little while. Okay, let's take a look then at introductions here. Question that we need to ask ourselves, I think, to begin with is, exactly what are the starting points for revising papers, and also for obviously for planning and drafting papers as well. And what we find is that regardless of whether we're revising, I'm sorry, I actually put the wrong slide in here, but we're talking about planning and drafting. So for planning, drafting, or revising, the starting point is the same. When you start thinking about this, all writing is a form of intellectual work. And like all forms of intellectual work, writing can be broken into goals. And like all goals, writing can be broken into tasks. And that's what I want to talk about here, is the kind of tasks, the kind of things we perform, the kind of things we do with language, with words, with ideas, to make them comprehensible to people. Okay, so if we take a look at basic goals for producing research papers, for example, research articles, we can see that we can break this down into three sets of goals. And the first of these is really planning and drafting. Paul Kotorski was touched on some of these things in his own talk. So I'm not going to really focus on them too much, but to to take a look, just to kind of set the context of everything here. Let's take a look at this. So the very first thing you need to do is to identify the paper's topic. But to do that, you really need to also think about choosing a conventional group of intended readers. In other words, who's actually going to be interested in this topic? Paul was talking about that a little bit. And then, of course, the paper's purpose. Why are you actually addressing this particular group of readers? So that's one thing that gets things started. And as you can see from the arrows here that are going on, this then sets us up to choose a conventional organizational framework. And then you go basically in two directions at the same time. This is why things can get difficult here, is you develop and word core information into a text. You also visualize and organize that core information into the text as well. And that's later planning and drafting. And that's really this is what I'll be focusing on tonight. Okay, we'll look at that in just a moment. Finally, we have, of course, revision and redrafting. We have, you need to basically be able to check the wording and organization of core information. You also need to be able to check format, punctuation, spelling, and check the visualization and organization of information. So, and as you can see, if you look at the arrows here, the black arrows are pushing us from left to right. The blue arrows for later planning and drafting, they're kind of going up and down in a sense, and then also pushing things to the right. And then finally, when we get to revision and redrafting, it goes all the way back to the beginning. So it's creating this kind of loop. And that's potentially problematic. Why? Because you can get into this whole loop of planning, drafting, revising, redrafting, back to planning and drafting and revising, that you go in a loop. So you need a way of breaking this. And that's what I'm calling tasks are all about. Okay. So let's take a look at this. So on the focus of my paper here tonight, my talk tonight is, I would like to look at choosing a conventional organizational framework and looking at the choices that you have for doing that. And then also I'd like to look at developing and wording a text, spelling error there, around core information. I'm not going to be too worried about visualizing core information and organizing core information because there's so much good work out there already. I actually don't have a whole lot to say about that. I do have quite a bit to say about the two areas in yellow, however. Okay, so let's take a look then at choosing an organizational framework. The first thing you have to do is you have to decide what type of organizational framework will best help you to develop your research paper. And we have two kinds of organizational frameworks. The first one is called the IA paper, and it's so called because it basically you basically have an introduction and then you have midsection arguments. So in this framework, you have a title, of course, you have an abstract, which may or may not be in the paper. I think we always say, though, it's a good idea to have an abstract. But I actually do see examples of a paper where the abstract will not appear in the paper. It may actually appear on a website someplace if the paper is in a journal that's behind a paywall, and you don't actually get to read the paper any longer until you've read the abstract and then paid money to download the article. Then, of course, we have our introduction. In some cases, there may be a section that gives background or theoretical foundations to talk about those things. Then you have the main part of the paper, which are a series of midsection arguments followed by a conclusion and references. So that may be one way that you want to go with a paper. The other is called an IMRD paper, the organizational framework there. And that looks a little bit differently, as you can see. Once again, we have a title, we have abstracts, we have introduction, we have background, theoretical foundations, but then we have methods, results, discussion, conclusion, and references. So you have to start to decide. I think it's a good idea to really actually decide which kind of organizational framework are you going to use. You can change your mind later on if it's not working out, but it's a good idea to figure out which way you're going to do, which way you want to really develop the paper. Now, there are certain reasons for building a paper around an IA organizational framework. And one of these is simply that it's a convention followed by your research community. So if your most people in your research community are organizing papers using this IA organizational framework, probably a good idea to follow that, unless, of course, there's some compelling reason not to. Likewise, your paper, we find that people use the IA framework when they're presenting research findings that are based mostly on qualitative data, or it may be a mix of qualitative and quantitative data. Then there's a tendency to use an IA framework here. And then also that you're addressing intended readers who hold alternative views about your topic. So in other words, what you're going to do, and if I could just go back here to this, what you're doing here is you're getting people into the arguments immediately. You're not so concerned about methods, you're not so concerned about results, but you want to get people straight into the argument because you want to address their concerns. Reasons for building a paper around an IMRD framework. Well, once again, it's the same thing that we just saw. It's a convention that's followed by your research community. So if most people in your research community, when they're writing papers, use IMRD, then probably you should consider doing that yourself. Once again, also then there's another thing here. Your paper presents results that are mostly based on quantitative data, and you're addressing intended readers who hold similar views to your views on the topic. And so then you may find people using an IMRD framework. So those are things to consider there. Now, I was saying that organizational frameworks are conventional, but that's not really the whole story. I'm going to be using a text, an article, okay, a research article, with the author's given me her permission to do this. And she started off. She basically writes it using an IA organizational framework, but then she does something rather interesting. Okay, so we have her abstract. She provides an abstract that she has a title for the paper: "The Flexible University, Neoliberal Education and the Global Production of Migrant Labor." Then she has an introduction section, of course, but then she has background in theoretical foundations. And normally you'd expect this to simply be two, basically one section. But what she does is she actually puts in two sections here. The first one, the neoliberal university and the role of flexibility. This is a theoretical discussion, basically, of neoliberal education and applying neoliberal principles of management to education, what happens there. Then she's presenting a case study. So in this case, she wants to actually bring her readers into a specific case study that she's going to be looking at. And this is centered in the Philippines. So Philippine higher education producing graduates for export. This is what she wants to talk about. Interestingly, she also adds methods. So in other words, she's taking something from the IMRD framework, and she's brought this over to her section. When I was talking to her about that a few years back, when I first started using this paper, she mentioned, well, I wanted people to see my method. And I said, well, actually, your method here is kind of conventional. I mean, nobody's going to really argue about this one way or the other. She said, that's true, but there's been so little work that's been done in the Philippines. I really felt that I needed to show people how I collected how I collected my data, how I analyzed that data into research findings. And then finally, of course, she does have her midsection arguments, which become actually the bulk of the paper, where she, as you can see here, she's talking about the flexible university, and flexible keeps coming up. So she's using this notion of neoliberal flexibility and how it affects the university. We'll get into that a little bit more, so I'm not going to try to get ahead of myself. Then, of course, she has her conclusion and references. So the thing is, you can play around with organizational frameworks somewhat. I mean, there are two kind of basic types of organizational frameworks that you can play with. But this is a good example of somebody who's in order to make what she's saying clear, she's changing, she's modifying the IA framework to make this work. And likewise, you need to kind of think about that ahead of time, like how would you actually do this, okay? Okay, so I'd like to now kind of get into basically looking at constructing a research paper introduction, okay? And let's see what happens here. Okay, so I'd like to give you an overview of core information and rhetorical functions. I was mentioning earlier at the beginning of this talk that introductions are rhetorically complex, and this is kind of what I'm talking about. We have one kind of core information. This is a literature review, okay? Now, what happens here is that we have a research, a research topic, you make a statement of the research topic and you embed that into a literature review. Why are you doing this? It's because you want to establish your research paper as important. In other words, you're answering a question, what does my research community currently know about the topic, and why does that matter to my research community? So it's a very, very specific question. Paul Kotorska was talking about a question of fact, and that's basically what you're doing here. This is a fact that currently frames my community's knowledge about about my topic. There's also a research gap. And once again, that gap is embedded into a literature review. Why? Because you're framing your paper as significant. And by significance in this particular case, what I'm talking about is what is currently not well understood about the topic, and why should it be better understood? So that's the second thing that's going on in the introduction. You have a research answer. Now, you notice my arrow here is broken, and I'll tell you why in just a moment. But whatever's happening with the research answer is that you're trying to establish your paper as new. In other words, what new understanding of the topic has emerged from the main research results? So that's what you're looking at. Now, the reason for the broken arrow is it is possible that your answer essentially is so new that previous literature has not been talking about this. It hasn't mentioned it. In other words, there's nothing to mention. On the other hand, it may be that other people have tried to answer or tried to fill in the research gap, and they have managed to fill it in, and they've done good work. So what you'd be doing in the research answer is you'd be making reference to basically, well, here's what other people have said about the answer, but I have something that has not been mentioned. And so you're basically highlighting the newness of your own answer against previous answers that have been given. Okay, we'll talk more about that in a bit. We'll see an example of that. Finally, you have an organizational forecast, and this is framing the paper as an article with arguable ideas. In other words, what points must be argued so that this new understanding that has emerged from the research answer is actually comprehensible. How do we even make it understandable to people? How do we fit it into existing frameworks that we do have and see similarities, see differences, see points of conflict, points of convergence, and so forth. Okay, so that's the overview, and that's what I want to talk about. Specific tasks that you can perform to to develop your paper as important, significant, new, and arguable. Okay, and doing that all right up front in the introduction. So first of all, well, first thing we need to think about then really here is the literature review. And I would strongly suggest you basically select studies for your literature review that are current. In other words, you want to provide a brief overview of the latest research on your topic. Somebody asked Paul Tosca, well, what happened if something's really, really famous? And most of the time, people aren't really interested in classic works. You know, because everybody in your research community probably knows this stuff already. So it's probably not necessary to really review the classics. What you really need is a brief overview. What's going on about this research topic right now? You know, in the last couple of years or thereabouts. Okay. It also has to be related, and when I use that term related, what I'm talking about is that your literature review works together to offer a clear description and explanation that reflects the clear understanding. So you basically have to show how different pieces of research actually converge together to describe and explain what the research community's understanding of the topic is. Okay, so you have to put that together. You have to put that together. And once again, we'll be seeing an example of that in a moment. Okay, and finally, it's relevant. You need to show that the topic is a matter of concern or interest to your research community. So let's see how this happens. Let's begin now with the research topic. The first thing I'm going to suggest is in early planning and drafting, later planning and drafting rather, is you construct a phrase that identifies what your article is about. And here's an example. In the past few decades have seen a massive transformation of the university. There it is right there, a massive university of the university. This becomes the topic, and it's been embedded into a sentence, okay? Then you need now, as I was saying before, you need to integrate that phrase into a literature review that frames the paper as important. And so again, you can see a nice clear example of this in this paper. In the past few decades have seen a massive transformation of the university where ideals of managerialism and corporate culture have come together to govern the operation and delivery of higher education. And that's, now I've got that in blue. Basically, it simply means that this is not the writer speaking. This is the writer actually saying, here's what other people have said. These changes are contextualized against the global spread of neoliberalism. Now, okay, neoliberalism, what are we talking about here? She does a very important thing at this point. She immediately, this is a key term, okay, in her paper, neoliberalism. She immediately gives us an operational definition of neoliberalism, a policy regime that discourages government intervention and upholds market ideals as the best means of running both economic and social institutions. So you can immediately see that she's putting together in a very kind of concentrated way. She's putting together what it is that her research community, and she's using 4 different studies. She's not using all the studies that she could have used, but she's using 4 studies that she feels are particularly germane to explaining what's at stake here. What are we talking about when we talk about massive transformation and everything like that? What seems to be the beginning points of all of this going on? Okay, so she's she's doing that. Notice one thing, just going back to something that Paul Kotorska said earlier, that when you're doing a literature review, you're not talking about X said this, Y said that, but you're taking studies and you're grouping them together. And we'll see how that works in just a moment, okay? So that's exactly what I want to talk about here now. You group reviewed studies together that present similar or same or similar understandings of the topic, okay? And then you note groups of studies that are presenting differing understandings of the topic. And so we can see what our author is doing right now, okay? So she says, education scholars describe the impact of such phenomenon in various ways. Some are optimistic about the emergence of a new university enterprise, and she quotes a couple of studies there, while others are wary of growing academic capitalism. Again, a couple of studies there. Amidst such academic discussion, the literature is replete with case studies of change within the university, such as dwindling public funds and heightened competition to recruit tuition-paying students. And she cites that. Now notice what she's doing here. She's grouped them. So we have one group of people represented by Magasin and Considine and Waldowski who are optimistic. See, she does it in one phrase. It's really very economical, but very clear. So they're optimistic about basically the application of neoliberal principles of management to university setting. Well, there's another group of people who are very, very wary about what they're calling academic capitalism. Okay, and so in other words, you have two groups of people within her community who have very, very different understandings of this transformational process that seems to be that's basically being powered by neoliberal thinking. Okay, and within that split, we're getting people talking about, well, dwindling public funds, heightened competition, tuition-paying students. Who do we want? Who do we don't want? So forth and so on, like that. So she's setting up her community's current understanding, but at the same time showing differences and basically tensions within the community. So that then brings us to a research gap here. Now, what we have here is you want to develop this research gap so that it's providing three kinds of information. It's what I'm going to call a bridge, a knowledge-based problem, and a research question. So the gap provides three kinds of information. One thing I have found with a lot of people's papers is that they don't have the gap in there. There's sometimes the problem. They'll be talking about problems, but they'll sometimes talking about real world problems, and somehow that we got to do something about this real world problem. But if you're writing a research article, the research article is not focused on a real world problem. It's a knowledge-based problem, maybe about real world problems, but until you solve the knowledge-based problem, there's no way that you can effectively solve the real world problem, if you follow what I'm saying there. So our job as researchers, basically, when we're coming up with a research gap, is to come up, there's something we don't understand about the topic. And because we don't understand that, that's leading us to a question. So once again, let's see how she does this. Now, her bridge is this. Yet, despite this growing literature, so she's talking about it. I mean, lots of people are discussing this, but she indicates, and she's indicating her gap right here. Despite this growing literature, existing studies tend to be situated within wealthy nations. I have 3 dots here because she's doing something else, and we'll look at that in just a moment, okay? Yet, fewer, and she's talking about theories of higher education here, have sought to define the diverse forms that this market can take and how its effects are felt in particular ways within different contexts. Okay, so she's talking about this. It remains unclear as to how market-driven policies and structures shape higher education on a global scale, especially in the case of developing nations beyond the West. So there's a lot going on in these three sentences right here. Okay, so first of all, she does indicate that there's a gap. In other words, she's saying existing studies tend to be situated within wealthy nations. Where's the gap? What's the gap? It's situated within wealthy nations. The question that she's trying to get readers to come up with is, so what's happening in the less wealthy nations? In other words, she's creating a gap there, and we'll see how she works that out in just a minute. And she says, yet few, in other words, theories of higher education have sought to define diverse forms that the market can take. Okay. Now she also does an interesting thing here as well. You notice she has two questions here. There are two how questions. These are basically her research questions right here. But one of these questions is not her question. The other question is her question. So in other words, she's not trying to answer two questions here. But if we take a look at the wording of this, we can see, yet few theories of higher education, and this is it. So these theories, in other words, these previous pieces of research, they have asked the question how its effects are felt within various ways in different contexts. They're not really asked. You know, they're not asking this question. Okay, they've been asking other questions, but they haven't asked this question. But you notice something about the question here, how its effects are felt in particular ways within different contexts. It's very, very general. She has to basically make the question more specific, and she does it this way. It remains unclear as to how market-driven policies and structures shape higher education on a global scale. And then she makes it even more specific, especially in the case of developing nations beyond the West. So very neatly and sweetly, she brings us to a very specific question that she's looking at here. But she'll even make it more specific in just a bit. Okay, now you need to that was her research gap, okay? But it's not enough to say it the way that she said it. She basically has to indicate that the gap is significant. Okay, there's really something at stake here that we don't understand. And because we don't understand this, in effect, our research community, without saying it, but our research community is ignorant of something that it should know about. Now, she can't go around saying, well, you know, we're a bunch of idiots because we haven't looked at my research question. You know, there's something wrong with people. Their research has been off. First of all, I mean, you can do this, I suppose. I've actually seen examples of people do this, but it's not a particularly effective way to deal with people. So the trick here is to, as you review the literature, especially on the gap, say, there's been previous research that has been done. You have to basically frame it as, this has been good research, but I want to push it further. And let's see how she does this. Okay, so once again, starting off with what we were looking at before, first sentence, yet despite this growing literature, existing studies tend to be situated within wealthy nations, creating a situation where higher education issues within specific countries like the United States largely inform theories used to analyze universities across the world. And so she's looking at somebody who said this. Basically, in other words, people are using models created in the United States to analyze universities and the effects of neoliberal education across the world. As noted by Goldson and Fatah, Many scholars apply ideas of neoliberal education as if it has no geographical or historical specificities. Okay, that was the missing sentence before, and this is where she's really beginning to show this is exactly what the gap is all about. So she's doing this through her literature review, right? That this is what the gap is. And she continues, higher education theories provide a rich discussion of how universities must negotiate educational goals within the neoliberal demands of the market. Yet, few have sought to define the diverse forms that this market can take and how its effects can be felt in specific ways within different contexts. And then she goes on to say, it remains unclear. And then she slots her question that's going to drive this whole paper in right there. Okay. So that's what she's doing. So it does become significant. In other words, you can see what's happening. People are using models created in the United States to analyze the effects of neoliberal education across the world. But suppose nobody has really actually looked at what's actually going on outside the United States, outside the UK, maybe, just maybe, this is what she's saying here. Maybe, just maybe, we don't have a full picture of what's going on. And maybe the research needs to be done. In a sense, that's what she's actually saying here, right? So she has a gap. You know, we have theories in the United States, the UK, but what about, and these are being applied to the rest of the world? Gosh, the world is a big place. Got to think about this. And in a sense, that's what she's saying. And I think she's trying to get her readers to engage these 4 sentences in that kind of way, to start thinking, yeah, there is a gap, and the gap matters because we don't really actually know what's going on. Then she comes up with a research answer. Now, what I would suggest here is that you develop a research answer that provides 2 kinds of information. Once again, there's a bridge, and then there's a summary of the main research results. And again, an example from our paper here. In this article, I demonstrate how a particular form of neoliberal education has come to play a distinct role in the global market for migrant labor, where a growing number of developing countries actively train citizens for overseas work in order to maximize future monetary remittances. And again, I'm going to leave the integration of the research answer into the literature review. Okay, here, local colleges and universities adopt market strategies in the hope of addressing the needs by foreign employees by altering program offerings and curriculum in line with labor demands beyond national borders. Okay, now I just make a note here. I think probably she could have used more specifically rather than here. I think it's a clearer term. However, I can't argue. This is a published article. Obviously, the editors had no problem with here. So who am I to say? But anyways, I think that's what it means. Now, to get back to this here. Now, what she's done here is she's summarized her main research results, okay, her findings here. And I've broken them up. I put them in blue so you can see actually what they are, but you can see how she strung them together. So I demonstrate how, and then she tells us where, why, in order to, okay, so forth and so on. Local college adopting market strategies in the hopes of addressing the needs of foreign employees. How do they do that? By, and so it goes on. So you can see how she summarized her main research findings really into basically these 2 sentences here. Paragraph 3.1, paragraph 3.2. Okay, so you can see how she's she's doing that. Likewise, your introduction needs to do the same kind of thing. You can't spend a lot of time actually, trying to go into a lot of detail. But what she's doing here is she's outlining things about the topic. She's outlining things about the gap, and especially the research question and the research answer that you need in order to kind of understand where she's coming from in all this. Finally, we have the organizational forecast. Okay, before we discuss our writer's organizational forecast, just a couple of things about organizational forecast that I want to point out. Okay, all organizational forecasts preview the sections of an article of articles that are in green. So if you have, okay, wrong place there. So if you're using an IMRD paper, okay, you'll basically be previewing the background and theoretical foundations, if there is one, methods, results, discussion, and conclusion. So that's essentially what you'll be doing there. On the other hand, if you have an IA paper, then you will be, if there is background and theoretical foundations, you will be doing that, and then you followed by the midsection arguments and conclusion. So that's basically how these things work. Okay. Let's see what she's done. So this is her the way that she has organized this. And again, I think it gives you a good idea of how this can be done. Once again, the organizational forecast has three kinds of information. Once again, there's that bridge, okay? And then there's a summary of main points to be argued in the midsections. And then it's followed by what I'm going to call concluding takeaways, okay? So once again, she starts off. So here's her bridge. The bridge here is a little longer than we've seen in other in the other parts of the introduction. Okay, so she starts off. I locate my study in the Philippines, one of the largest labor exporting nations in the world, where close to 1 million workers leave the country for overseas jobs every year. And she gives her source for that. In particular, I argue that in a similar way, okay, this becomes the first point of argument here, okay? The migrant labor commodity chain encourages such flexibility from Philippine higher education, pushing school administrators to predict labor gaps in other countries. And second point that's going to have to be argued, quickly shift, quickly shift resources to programs that produce the right type of workers at the right time. So that's the first thing she's doing there. But the argument continues. Yet this argument also shows that such attempts at flexibility lead to problematic outcomes for teachers and students, undermining the job security of college faculty and creating a haphazard use of space as administrators build and convert classrooms depending on the demand for particular majors. Okay, so you can see what she's doing here. She's summarized the major the arguments that she's going to be making, and she lists them in the order that they're going to be made later on in the midsections of the paper. In talking with her, I know she spent a lot of time figuring out exactly how to summarize her arguments and stuff, so that she could do this. There are two ways of maybe thinking about the organizational framework. Actually, I'm sorry, the organizational forecast. Sorry, the organizational forecast. You could wait until you write the midsections of the paper, because then you actually really know what the arguments are, and then you put them into the introduction once you're happy with your understanding of what your arguments are. The other way of doing this, though, is this way. You haven't written the midsection arguments yet, Okay, you know what they are, but you haven't written them. So to keep your mind, to keep yourself focused on what the main claims are going to be, you basically write them out in the way that we've seen her do here, and then you use that as a guide when you go to write the midsection arguments. It can go either way. Some people like to do the organizational forecast first, and if they have to change it later on, they change it, and then they use it. They use things like I've showed you here in orange. They use that as a guide for developing the arguments later on. Sometimes people like to develop the arguments first, and then they summarize and they put it in here. They put it in the organizational forecast, and you have to figure out which way works for you best. Then, in any case, she's going to go on with now her takeaways. I conclude this argument. Once again, you can see a bridge here, basically from basically summarizing her arguments to what's going to happen at the end of the paper. I conclude this argument with a discussion of how neoliberal education institutions within migrant-sending nations actually behave less like academic corporations or enterprises, popular labels used to describe the current marketization of universities in the West. In the case of the Philippines, colleges and universities act more like third world factories that produce goods for today's global economy, and flexibility is the ideal standard by which school owners and administrators define higher education. Wow. Okay, that's she's making a statement there. Okay, and that's where the paper will end with this takeaway. This is what she wants people to think about as they read the article. So these are the takeaways, but she's already told them these are the takeaways. That this is how I want you to understand what I'm writing. You may not agree with me. That's okay. In fact, actually, we can almost argue when you're doing this kind of thing that even if somebody looks at your paper and they've read it and they say, I don't know why I've just read this article, and I don't know why the earth just doesn't open up and swallow this person. I can't believe anything they've said, but I understand where they're coming from, and that's what you want. You don't want to get people's agreement necessarily. What you want them to say is, I agree with this, or I don't agree with this thing. It doesn't make any difference whether people agree, but I understand why they have said what they're saying. And once you've done that, you've got a successful argument. Okay. All right, but more about arguments tomorrow. Okay. In conclusion, then, just a couple of essential points to make here. Organizational frameworks help your reader to follow your lines of analysis and argument. Now, before drafting your article, think about how you want to organize your article. Do you want to use an IA, or do you want to use an IMRD organizational framework? I think if you make that decision early on, and you can always change your mind, it helps you to select information more easily, because you've already seen in the introduction, there's, as I say, there's a lot of stuff going on there with the kind of information and the way that you're integrating that information into a literature review. And the literature review itself is quite complex, as we've seen as well, right? So if you can clear the idea of framework first, it helps. It simplifies things somewhat. Okay, and of course, you also need to think about whether or not, okay, you've chosen a particular type of framework, fine, but you can always modify that framework to suit your needs, so that you're making your line of analysis and your line of argument clear to people, right? In terms of research introduction, they're relatively short, but they are rhetorically complex, and and this is something I really want you to think about here, okay? Well-written introductions will help your readers see whether you are extending, modifying, replacing, or defending your research community's current understanding of your topic. In other words, by the time your research article is finished, by the time it's finished, your readers should have a sense. It may not be fully formed yet, but they have a sense of whether you are simply extending your research community's understanding of your research topic, or that you're modifying your research community's understanding of the research topic because you realize that this current understanding is unable to describe or explain adequately some aspect of the topic. Now, you don't want to get rid of the current understanding. You don't want to replace it or anything, but you do want to strengthen it so it becomes descriptively and explanatorily more adequate. Okay, or, and this is rare, maybe they realize that you want to take that current understanding of your research communities that your research community has of your topic, and you want to replace it completely. Or the fourth thing, certain people have come up with claims against your community's current understanding of the topic, and you regard those claims as inadequate, and you want to show that those claims do not work, and that you are in effect defending your community's understanding of the current topic as it stands. Okay, so they should be able to go away, and they should be able to do that because, as we'll see tomorrow, your arguments will be all about extending, modifying, or defending your research community's current understanding of the topic. That's where they are. Okay, that's where they're going to be. So, before drafting the article, then think about how you need to integrate your research topic, gap, and answer into a literature review so that you basically can give people this feel for where the paper is going. Okay, a few references here that I've put on here. I do like John and Lynn Laughlin's Analyzing Social Settings. I've got a lot of ideas from these guys. The paper I'm using is by Yasmin Ortega. This has been published in the British Journal of Sociology back in 2018. I first saw her paper in a conference, and I asked her if I could use the paper, and I did for a few years, but she got the thing published, so now I use the actual paper. And of course, there's John Swales and Christina Feek. Susan Nerney will have more to say about these guys, but academic writing for graduate students, very, very good, something very good to take a look at, okay? So these are things to take a look at. The Laughlins, take a look at Swales and Feek, okay? They have lots of really good ideas. And finally, I want to, there's an appendix here to this, to these slides. Tomorrow, we're going to be talking about argumentation, and midsection arguments are really all about the way that your aspects of your research topic are connected together, the way that they're related. And when we take a look at understanding, really, I mean, what we're going to see is when we talk about a research community's understanding of the research topic, it's really an understanding of what kind of relationships that connect aspects of the topic together. And of course, the whole idea is with your research article is what you want to show is that I'm changing your view of how things are related. So you have to have a very clear idea as to what kind of relationships we're really talking about here. So before my talk tomorrow, can you please go through this and take a look at some of the things I'm saying? What I'm doing here is I've broken up these relationships that they basically commonly commonly researched relationships. I'm breaking up into external characteristics and behavior, 3 types here, as you can see, and I've defined these things. And I want you to start thinking about your own research findings. And is your research has it sought to try to understand external characteristics and behaviors of the things that you're studying, or perhaps you're looking at internal characteristics and behaviors. It's like structure and process. Or perhaps you're looking at unintentional, naturally occurring interventions in the social world where different structures and different processes come together, and they're being caused by certain things. Okay, or maybe you're really looking at the consequences of interactions between things, or maybe you're looking at intentional human intervention to the socio-physical world. In other words, you're looking at human agency, and maybe you're looking at the way that various things combine together. So I'd like you to start thinking about these things. I've given you some operational definitions of each of these 8 terms. Okay, so take a look at those things and start thinking about your own papers. Where are your papers heading for? And so forth. And that hopefully that will help you start to think about the kind of arguments that you need to make later on. Okay. Well, with that, I'm going to say thank you very much. Thank you for your patience, and see you tomorrow. So I'm going to stop sharing now, and we can go back to the main website. Okay.
Okay, yeah, please once again give a big round of applause for Paul Learning. Yeah, that was definitely very informational presentation. I'm not sure if you can see me. I'm in other participants, but I've been, taking notes this whole past hours before. It's also very beneficial for me, to try to pinpoint what I've been lacking in my writing. So, yeah, I think without further ado, I think I'm just going to go delve into the questions.
Questions, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, but before that, maybe I would like to remind the participants, due to the number of the questions that we receive and the restricted amount of time, maybe you can always refer to the frequently asked question sheet that we already sent you and the one that we will send you for this workshop, in order for you to find your questions being answered there. Okay, so the first question for Prof. Paul Learning, this is from Diana. What are the pitfalls to avoid when writing the significance of the paper? This is from Diana.
I'm sorry. What are the pitfalls for what?
To avoid.
Okay, in the introduction of the paper.
Yeah. I think. Yeah.
Okay, pitfalls. Yes, there are pitfalls. What I've noticed over the last 7 years when we've been doing these workshops, almost always there's no research question. It's quite amazing, oftentimes, and there's no. Oftentimes, because of that, because there's no research question, the answer or what they're giving as an answer is just a kind of an unfocused set of responses to questions, what Paul Kotarski was called questions of fact, but we're not getting what he was calling explanations or interpretations. So that becomes the biggest. That really becomes the biggest problem there. I mean, in one sense, what I was saying in this lecture tonight has been kind of a way of getting what Paul was talking about, Paul Kotarski was talking about, like getting your explanation is how does this happen, why does this happen, or interpretation or interpretations. This is what it actually leads to. This is how things impact on each other. I have a little bit more to say about that tomorrow, actually. But yeah, that's if you can really think about. You can really think about what is the research question. It's always a question of analysis. It's a question of analysis that begins with how or begins with why. It's not a question that begins with what. It's not a question that begins with where, when. Those are questions you had to ask while you were doing your research to get an idea. And also those questions of fact. That's actually what lands up in the. Actually, it's in this section. If you're trying to produce what I'm calling background, okay, before you actually get into the research gap, oftentimes those questions of fact are being answered there, and those are questions you first asked in your research, and so you don't lose those questions, but it's a question of where you're putting them in the paper. So one of the first places that questions that the questions of fact will go will be actually not in the introduction. It'll be in the next section. It'll be in the section that I was calling background/theoretical foundations. So that's essentially where that's essentially where it'll be. Okay. Anything else to say? Oh yeah. The other big thing is literature review. Sometimes in some people's introductions, the literature review just overwhelms everything. In other words, the person, it's almost like the writer loses his or her voice and just is just basically trying to repeat what other people have said and never ever really actually getting to their to the gap that they have found, never ever getting to the research question, never getting to a research answer. They just give this kind of literature view that kind of meanders all over the place. Like, and this is again what Paul Kotarski was talking about. X says this, Y says that, Z says this, then A, B, and C said that, and so it becomes like an annotated bibliography, and kind of a crazy annotated bibliography in a sense. So you want to really avoid that. Yes, definitely the introduction should have a literature review, but it's really doing those three things. It's framing a paper as important, significant, new, and arguable. So that's you want to make that literature review work for you, not just saying here's what other people have said and losing your own voice in the process. Okay, I see Susan's hand and Paul's hands are up, so I guess they want to talk. Can they talk?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, Paul Nerney, by the way, there's going to be another question about, literature review and introduction, but I'll get back to you later.
Okay.
But I'll give the time to Susan. Maybe you raise your hand first.
Okay, I'm sorry, but I don't know. I hope this is not a premature point to raise. One of the pitfalls that I've seen in many of the introductions is the fact that there is no one research question. They talk about 2 or 3 research questions. And I really think everybody should remember, if you're dealing with one research article, you deal with one research question, not 2 or 3, because that would mean 2 or 3 articles. Anyway, the question on pitfalls kind of like intrigued me, because that's one pitfall that I think people should be wary of.
Yeah, I think Susan's right on that as well, because what happens is, it is true. You can take a research question, you can break it down into parts, and then that's probably okay. But what Susan's talking about, and we see this all the time, is it's like people are using the first draft of their paper, like trying to decide what is my research question, and because they've had a research project that's sometimes been quite big, that actually you can get 2 or 3 papers out of that. So what they're doing is they're listing all the research questions they could possibly write about, but then you're talking about 2 or 3 different papers rather than just one paper. And that, and I can see doing that. You're trying to discover, but really you've got to, in the end, you've got to make a decision about which one of those questions do you really want to answer. And please don't try to answer the 3 questions all together, because the paper will totally lose focus and really need intensive rework. I guess Paul Kotarski's hand still patiently up. Go ahead, Paul.
Yes, Paul, please.
Okay, well, I'm not going to say very much here, because I think what both Paul and Susan have said is spot on. I've seen papers come in with 3, 4 questions struggling to be heard and actually not being very effective at all. No, I'm just going to say very simply, this is going to sound stupid, but
there's no such.
Well, yeah, this will sound stupid though.
No.
Listen. Questions.
Okay.
Questions end with question marks, and I have time and again. You ask somebody, give me a question, and what they come back with is not a question. And it can be a topic, it can be a statement of some kind, but what we're looking for with a research question is something that is a genuine question. And these genuine questions will begin with words like who, what, when, where, and then especially why and how. So focus on the fact that a question really does a particular thing, and then an answer responds to that. So that's all I want to say right now.
I love this man. That's exactly right. Yes, yes. That's why I work with him. Okay, I'm sorry. I was just having a moment there. Yeah. Other questions.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. I think Susan is raising her hand again.
Oh, okay.
Susan, would you like to add something?
Yes. Sorry, yes. Just apropos to what Paul Kratoska mentioned. I'm going to talk about this in my lecture on Wednesday. But what you need to learn to do is to create what I call an indirect question. So rather than asking, how do economic sanctions function in the Middle East or something like that? That's a direct question and could be a research question, but you could usually phrase it so that it is a sentence and the question is buried in your sentence. So like the research answers the question of how da 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 da. You know what I mean? So there is a question, but it is not written like a question. It's written as a statement. But it's still a research question. Did I? Okay, sorry.
No, that's correct. And oftentimes it's an indirect question. Yeah, and that's a very common way of doing things. Sure. Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm not going to disagree with that, except to say that you need to be careful that an editor reading this understands what you're doing. I mean, whether you do it as a direct question or an indirect question, but don't be too cute with it. Don't hide what you're doing.
Absolutely.
All right. Yeah, there has been like a very great input from some of our presenters that I think will be very beneficial for all the participants. Yeah, I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is for, this is regarding the literature review and introduction part for Paul Nerney. So we have a question from Artanti from UPGRI. Is it better to incorporate the literature review into the introduction in order to state the gaps in research? And what strategies can we take to avoid repeating statements if the literature review is separated from the introduction?
A nice question. Yeah, thank you for that. Well, to begin with, the literature review definitely begins in the introduction for reasons that I was mentioning, to basically frame your question as your article as important, significant, new, and arguable. Okay, you do that. However, now sometimes the literature or previous research may have possibly, come up with some very, very thorny, complex, complicated issues that need to be explained further before people can actually really be able to follow your midsection arguments later on in the paper. And in that case, then you would have that section I was calling. Sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. The background / theoretical foundations, where you start to elaborate on certain points that you may have raised in the introduction, but you feel, given your readers, that you need to be able to explain a bit further exactly what's at stake here. What has been going on, because it's going to really affect the arguments that you're making later on. So basically, avoid the thing you want to avoid, however, though, is coming up with a theoretical foundation / background section where you're just showing off. I have read everything on this topic that exists, and I want to display my knowledge because I think that's what I should be doing. That's kind of a Tiro mistake. That's somebody who's still acting like a student rather than as a professional researcher. And so you don't want to do that. But if there are substantive issues that need to be discussed in more detail before somebody can actually understand what your arguments are about, then yeah, you definitely do that. So it would be and you need to make that clear when you're doing when you're writing the paper, and you need to make a decision. Do I really need to elaborate anything more anymore on something, or have I given them enough information in the introduction? You would want to try in the introduction to give them everything they need to know to be able to follow the arguments, but sometimes it's just not possible. Anyways, I give the floor to Paul.
Okay, well,
Okay,
again,
Paul.
I'm not going to add very much, but personally, I don't like to see a section called literature review in an article.
True.
That's what you do when you're trying to demonstrate to your professors, I have covered everything.
Yep.
But what you need to be doing is you do need to review the literature, but you do it in the course of talking about the issues and the topic that you're developing. So it's there, but setting it aside as a special section is often not very productive.
Yeah. And I mean, no, that's true. I mean, and sometimes to handle the complexity of things, you can actually bring that down to your to the arguments themselves, to the discussion section in the IMRD part of the paper, or what I'm calling midsection arguments in the IA section. So yeah, that's true. I mean, that's.
All right, thank you very much. The next question will be about, has something to do with the Indonesian study, I believe. So, yeah, I think both of all of the presenters can maybe chime into this question. So, do you have any strategy on how to make a specific information about Indonesia becomes more interesting for wider public? Because my first article was rejected with this kind of argument. This is from Anita from the Netherlands. Okay.
Paul, that sounds like your question, actually.
Well, I don't know if I have too much to add to what I said during the talk, but fundamentally, you're trying to find something that, I mean, consider what okay, look at the topic or the subtopic that your research is on, and how it's discussed in other contexts in other countries. And you're trying to figure out what you can say to somebody who's doing similar sorts of research in another country that will be interesting to them, or what they could say to you. And it's not going to be all the minutiae, all the details about the particular place where you did your work, but it's more what kind of general conclusion are you drawing on that basis. I mean, the examples that I gave, I mean, what I was trying to suggest there, and I guess I didn't quite get it all said, but you start off looking at this general level. And so I was talking about power and authority. The people that are writing about power and authority generally are part of the source material that you're going to refer to. People who are writing about power and authority in other countries. You may cite some of their work, but if you're citing their work, you're not going to be saying, okay, in Japan or in the United States, this is the way it works. You're going to be saying, rather, based on what happens there, I draw this conclusion about power and authority. Does that apply to Indonesia? So it's the kind of abstracting or making a general point based on your material that then can be used by somebody who is doing similar sorts of research, but somewhere else. I hope that's sort of clear, but anyway, that's my answer.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul Katoska and Paul Nurni. I think I just have several questions left. Wait, let me look at the list. Hold on. Yeah, so I think one of the questions regarding the abstract and conference. Yeah, so this is from Fahmi. So he asked about how to write an abstract that would be submitted in the conference while the article is still not made, because it sometimes happened to some participants candidate of a conference. Thank you. Is it possible? Is it? Yeah.
Ouch. Yeah, it's that's tough. That's really tough. I mean, let's face it. If you actually haven't written the paper yet, and you're writing, and you're sending an abstract in, then probably what you're really doing is you're actually proposing a paper. In fact, it's interesting when you look at people's abstracts, and they say, the point that Paul Kutarska was making, in this paper I try to, or in this paper I will do such and such a thing. I mean, it's obviously it hasn't been done yet. But this is true. I mean, for a lot of conferences, I mean, oftentimes people are just asking you to outline a particular paper that you feel you can get done before the conference, and so the assumption, I think, is that you've done some bit of thinking about the paper. You can kind of conceptualize the paper somewhat, and that you can write an abstract like sort of thing. I mean, typically, I think what you might get is, I mean, to do it successfully, you say, well, this is my topic. This is the problem. You may not even have the answer yet. You may not have finished analyzing data, so you're a little light on an answer. But you can at least hypothesize what the answer might be, and so you kind of do that. And yeah, and if people think the topic's interesting enough and the question's interesting enough, maybe you'll get the paper accepted to a conference. Yeah.
Well, part of the point
not ideal though, not ideal.
Yeah, part of the point about a conference is that people try out ideas.
Yeah, try out.
So so it's really perfectly reasonable for a conference paper that the abstract is essentially saying, this is what I'm going to do. But for the paper itself, when it's going out for publication, the abstract needs to be saying, this is what I've done. So the projection, what I'm going to do versus what I've already done. But I think people organizing conferences generally will realize the value of a trial. You try something out and people respond, and then you develop it further.
All right, then. Yeah, I hope that answered your question. Okay, so the next question is about, okay, so this is from Wayan Andiana. So he say that I have a draft paper from my research from 2016 to 2017 before COVID-19 about firm innovation performance. Do you think it will still be able to be published after 5 years? And do you have any suggestions for that paper? The data is primary data from Indonesia. Well, yeah, is it still possible to publish a research after 5 years? Maybe for...
I think it depends on how much research has been done after that. And I mean, 5 years will not invalidate your data, but it might. I mean, it's really important that you keep up to date on what's been said in the past 5 years, because for sure an editor looking at that is going to be questioning whether this is still valid, and you need to be aware of that, and the editor or the referees are going to be, I mean, presumably checking, has the situation changed, and also whether COVID has changed that situation, because the world has changed. So you need to consider that as well.
Okay, then. All right, I think just one last question before maybe we end our session for today. So this is regarding retrieving data. This is from Dwi. So yeah, first and foremost, I want to express my gratitude for this helpful explanation for the presenters. And the question is, when retrieving data, the writer occasionally does not find a valuable data. So what should the writer do to obtain insightful data? Thanks in advance. Yeah.
Shall I take it? Or?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, you can't write about data you don't have. So it's a little bit of a strange question, but I think the answer really is that everybody, when they're doing research, comes up with certain questions that they would like to answer. And just about everybody fails to answer some of those questions. So you're collecting a body of information, and it will serve to answer some questions, but not necessarily everything you'd like to know. So the issue comes down to this: is there some other source of information you can go to that might provide the answer to the question you'd like to ask? If there's not, then you just can't deal with that question. You have to respond, and we have to develop an article based on a different question. I suppose the classic example, I'm a historian, and one of the things that has become really apparent is that if you're looking at the past, say the 19th century or before, most of the literature and most of the documents are about men. And obviously women were there, women were doing things, and we would really like to know more about that. And people have actually been ingenious in trying to find sources that will provide some insights. But fundamentally, if you're relying on documents, things that are not in the documents you can't deal with.
All right, then maybe Paul or Ernie, would you like to add something? Or maybe Susan?
No, I'm good.
Okay, then yeah, I think that's pretty much it for the questions that we have today. Again, for all of you who might have not been answered, your questions, don't worry, we will definitely send you the frequently asked questions sheet that will be sent out to you after this. And you can always access the previous workshops frequently asked questions also, in order to maybe try to figure out whether some questions have been answered or not. Okay, and yeah, so we have reached the end of the first day of the AIFIS-SSRC workshop on academic writing for international publication. Once again, thank you very much for our presenters today, to Paul Kratowska and also Paul Nurni, for your wonderful presentations. I believe we have learned a lot today, and yeah, looking forward to hearing your presentations on the next days. And also thanks to all of the participants who contributed with the questions to our Q&A sessions. Yeah, please, maybe we can give a big round of applause once again to Paul Kratowska and also Paul Nurni. Thank you very much. Yeah, this is still our first day. You can imagine how fun it will be, during for the whole 3 day of this workshop. Okay, tomorrow we pick up with day 2 of the workshop. A short reminder that the start time for the workshop tomorrow begins at 7 p.m. Western Indonesian time, right? So 7 p.m. Western Indonesian time. It will be 30 minutes later than we begin today. There is also a different link for the webinar, which we will drop into the chat box now. Okay, yeah, the company will send the link for the webinar. Okay, maybe before I conclude, maybe I'm just going to share something. Yeah, please make sure that you follow our social media to get all the updates about IFIS activities and other opportunities. You can tune into our Facebook page at the IFIS page, and then we also have Instagram at ifis.official. And yeah, please also don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel at IFIS. Okay, and you can always go to our website at www.ifis.org. Okay, yeah. I believe the committee has already sent the link for tomorrow's webinar. So yeah, for tomorrow, Paul Nerney will continue on to part 2 of his presentation on planning and drafting strategies for research papers. And Paul Kratoska will give presentations on the ethics of scholarly communication and why your dissertation is not a book. So yeah, that's basically it for me. Thank you very much. I'm Firman signing out. We look forward to seeing you all again tomorrow. Goodbye.